When you look at religion through the lens of history, you quickly realize that human imagination has no limits. People have followed ideas that range from mildly odd to completely absurd. And the most surprising part is not that someone once believed them. It's that entire communities, sometimes millions of people, have treated them as unquestionable truth. Take the idea of sacred underwear. In some faiths, followers wear specific garments under their clothes, believing the fabric itself provides spiritual protection against evil. It doesn't matter that the material is just cotton or polyester. The belief transforms it into a kind of invisible armor. The thought that an all-powerful deity would care whether you're wearing the right underwear is bizarre when you step back, yet it's a practice taken with complete seriousness. Or consider the ancient belief that menstruating women could spoil crops and sour wine simply by existing near them. Entire laws were written to keep women isolated during their cycles, based on the assumption that their bodies radiated destructive energy. Today, we know menstruation is a biological process, not a supernatural curse. But for centuries, this superstition justified discrimination and control, giving absurdity the weight of divine command. Then there are snake-handling churches. In certain parts of the United States, believers literally pick up venomous snakes during worship to prove their faith. They cite a passage about treading on serpents without harm. What happens, of course, is that people get bitten, sometimes fatally. Yet the practice continues because the danger itself is seen as proof of commitment. Faith here becomes a deadly dare, with absurdity written into the ritual. Dietary taboos also highlight how arbitrary religious rules can be. Entire communities have avoided certain foods not for health reasons, but because someone once declared them spiritually unclean. Pork, shellfish, even onions have been banned at different times by different groups. In some cases, these rules might have had practical origins in ancient conditions, but the idea that the universe's creator would be deeply offended by your lunch choices stretches credibility. Yet to break these rules in some cultures is treated as a serious offense against the divine. One of the strangest examples comes from a sect that believes a prophet left behind sealed boxes containing divine secrets to be opened only under special conditions. Generations later, the boxes are still locked, with no one daring to open them because the mystery itself sustains the belief. The absurdity isn't just in the unopened box, it's in the fact that faith can survive for centuries on the promise of contents that may be nothing at all. Absurd beliefs don't just survive, they shape entire societies. Ancient Aztecs believed the sun would die if they didn't offer human sacrifices to nourish it. Thousands of lives were taken to keep the solar engine running, as if the universe itself was a machine powered by human hearts. The sun, of course, kept rising regardless. But the fear of cosmic collapse made the absurd seem necessary, and religion gave that fear structure. Even today, there are groups who believe that the world is only a few thousand years old, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Fossils, geology, astronomy, all dismissed because an ancient text written by people who had never left their corner of the world says otherwise. The absurdity here isn't just in the belief. It's in the way it forces people to deny everything we've learned about the universe in order to protect a fragile idea. These examples are not random quirks. They reveal something deeper about how absurdity can thrive when it's wrapped in ritual, tradition, and authority. On their own, these ideas would sound laughable, but when they're presented as sacred, they gain power. People stop questioning and start obeying, and the line between tradition and absurdity disappears. One belief that stands out for its absurdity is the idea that specific numbers or letters hold cosmic power. Numerology has convinced entire groups that calculating the right combination of digits can unlock divine secrets or predict the future. People have rearranged names, avoided marriage dates, or even refused certain phone numbers because they thought the digits would summon bad luck or divine anger. When you peel it back, it's just math being treated as magic. But in the framework of faith, it feels profound instead of ridiculous. Cargo cults offer another fascinating case. In the South Pacific during the mid-20th century, indigenous groups who had seen Western soldiers arrive with vast supplies of goods during World War II started building mock airstrips, wooden radios, and bamboo airplanes. They believed these rituals would attract more planes from the sky, carrying gifts from the gods. The absurdity lies in mistaking military logistics for divine blessing, but it also shows how quickly humans can ritualize misunderstanding into sacred tradition. In parts of India, there are sects that venerate rats, not just tolerating them, but actively feeding and protecting them as sacred animals. Temples are dedicated to the rodents, and believers drink milk from bowls shared with thousands of the creatures. To outsiders, it seems absurd to treat vermin as divine messengers. But within that belief system, it's considered an act of devotion. The tension between disgust and reverence is precisely what makes it such a striking example of how faith reshapes perception. There are also religions that insist on avoiding modern medicine, believing that prayer alone is sufficient for healing. This has led to tragic deaths, especially of children, when easily treatable illnesses went untreated. The absurdity here is deadly, denying the clear evidence of medical science in favor of rituals that demonstrably fail. Yet within those groups, faith in prayer is stronger than any doctor's advice. In other traditions, absurdity shows up in the way the afterlife is imagined. Some texts describe heaven in terms of food, drink, or sensual pleasure, as if eternity would be a cosmic buffet or a permanent honeymoon. Others describe hell in excruciatingly specific ways, including demons dedicated to punishing trivial sins, like failing to say a prayer at the right time. The absurdity isn't just in the details, it's in the attempt to turn vast cosmic mysteries into crude human fantasies of reward and punishment. So why do these beliefs endure, even when they seem absurd to outsiders? Part of the answer lies in psychology. Once an idea is labeled sacred, questioning it feels dangerous. People fear not only divine punishment but also social rejection. In communities built around belief, accepting the absurd becomes a way of signaling loyalty. Refusing to question becomes proof of belonging. Another factor is storytelling. Humans are wired to respond to vivid, memorable stories more than abstract truths. A story about a snake handler surviving a bite or a prophet predicting a disaster is more compelling than statistics about snake venom or weather patterns. Stories stick, even when they're unbelievable, and when told often enough, they become the glue that holds groups together. Absurd beliefs also thrive because they offer simplicity. The world is complicated, full of uncertainty. A rule that says, "Don't eat this food," or "wear this garment," or "say these words at this time," gives life structure. It feels like control in a world that often feels uncontrollable. And once that structure is in place, people rarely step back to ask whether the rule makes any sense at all. This is what makes absurd beliefs powerful. They don't survive in spite of their strangeness. They survive because of it. The very absurdity makes them memorable, distinctive, and hard to ignore. When something feels bizarre, it grabs attention, and when framed as sacred, it resists scrutiny.
One of the clearest signs of how absurdity can turn into devotion is the way some cult leaders invent rituals that have no purpose other than to test obedience. Kikin. In the 20th century, there were groups that insisted followers shave their heads, wear identical clothing, or avoid specific colors because their leader declared it sacred. None of these practices had spiritual logic on their own. They were absurd by design. The absurdity was the point, because it separated the true believers from the skeptics. If you're willing to do something irrational, it proves you're loyal. Purity rules provide another fertile ground for absurdity. Some religions claim that touching certain objects, or even certain people, makes you spiritually unclean, requiring rituals to restore purity. In extreme cases, followers avoid anyone outside the group, terrified of contamination. It's not about hygiene. It's about creating boundaries that define insiders and outsiders. The absurdity of believing a handshake or a shared meal could taint your soul doesn't matter when the rule itself becomes a badge of belonging. Other traditions elevate specific animals to sacred status in ways that defy reason. Cows wandering city streets without being harmed, monkeys allowed to steal food from market stalls, or crocodiles treated as holy guardians. The absurdity here isn't just in the reverence, it's in the way the belief reshapes behavior, forcing people to tolerate disruption because it's framed as divine will. There are also religions that place enormous weight on small, everyday actions, like whether you eat with the correct hand or whether you face the right direction while relieving yourself. To outsiders, these rules sound laughable, but within the system, they become moral absolutes. The absurdity lies in reducing cosmic morality to bathroom etiquette. Yet that's precisely how belief can transform the mundane into the sacred. One of the most shocking examples comes from groups that practice self-harm or extreme fasting as proof of faith. Followers are told that suffering itself brings them closer to the divine. Voon, some whip themselves, others starve themselves, convinced that pain is a pathway to holiness. The absurdity here is deadly. It takes the natural instinct to avoid harm and flips it into a demonstration of loyalty. Instead of questioning the cruelty, believers accept it as sacred duty. Absurd beliefs also thrive on prophecy, especially when those prophecies repeatedly fail. We've seen groups who confidently declare the end of the world, only to revise the date when nothing happens. Each failure should destroy credibility, but instead, many followers take the absurd step of doubling down, convinced that the mistake was their misunderstanding rather than proof the prophecy was false. The absurdity here isn't just in the prediction, it's in the refusal to let go after it collapses. What's fascinating is how often absurdity becomes a feature rather than a flaw. When beliefs defy logic, they create a stronger bond among those who accept them. It's a way of saying, we're so devoted that we'll embrace what outsiders call ridiculous. This dynamic makes absurdity self-reinforcing. The harder it is to accept, the more loyalty it proves. And this is why absurd beliefs don't just survive, they thrive. They filter out skeptics, strengthen group cohesion, and make belonging feel costly enough to be meaningful. The absurdity is precisely what makes them powerful. Absurd religious beliefs aren't just relics of the past or quirky practices tucked away in obscure sects. They still shape politics, law, and daily life in ways that affect millions of people. Rules about what people can wear, who they can marry, what they can eat, and even which medical care they can access are often rooted in beliefs that collapse under the slightest scrutiny. Yet because they're treated as sacred, they continue to govern real lives. Take the debate over women's rights. In many societies, laws restricting women's dress, mobility, or access to education are justified by religious rules that claim modesty or submission is divinely required. The absurdity of dictating someone's wardrobe as a matter of cosmic importance doesn't weaken these rules. They're defended fiercely as moral imperatives. What starts as absurdity becomes systemic control. In politics, we see leaders using absurd beliefs as tools of influence, swearing oaths on holy books, invoking divine authority in debates about science or medicine, or insisting that natural disasters are punishments from the heavens. These statements often sound absurd when taken literally, but they carry weight because people are conditioned not to question them. The absurdity is hidden under a cloak of tradition and reverence. Even in everyday life, absurdity can have quiet but powerful effects. Children are taught myths about eternal rewards and punishments, often so vividly described that they create lifelong fears. Communities argue over whether two people's love is legitimate based on what an ancient text says about gender roles. Entire economies adjust around holy days, rituals, and taboos that made sense to small tribes centuries ago, but look bizarre in the modern world. The important thing to notice is that absurdity doesn't weaken belief. It often strengthens it. When a rule or story makes no sense, following it becomes a demonstration of loyalty. It proves devotion precisely because outsiders see it as irrational. And this is why absurd beliefs are so durable. They function as filters, keeping the faithful inside and skeptics outside. But there's another side. Pointing out absurdity can be liberating. When someone finally steps back and says, "Wait, why would a god care about this?" Still, it can break the spell. The absurdity that once seemed untouchable suddenly looks ridiculous. What once felt sacred is revealed as arbitrary. That moment of clarity has freed countless people from fear and guilt imposed by beliefs that never held up to reason. Absurd beliefs will always exist because human beings crave meaning, structure, and belonging. But recognizing them for what they are is essential, not to mock those who follow them, but to question the systems that use absurdity as a tool of control. When rules are stripped of their sacred disguise, they can be judged on their actual merit. And often, they turn out to be nothing more than human inventions, dressed up as divine commands. So the most absurd religious beliefs people follow aren't just odd curiosities, they're reminders of how easily tradition can mask nonsense, how fear can enforce obedience, and how powerful it is when someone finally dares to laugh at the absurd and walk away. What's striking about absurd religious beliefs is how quickly they can normalize. When people grow up inside a system, what looks irrational from the outside can feel completely ordinary on the inside. Sacred underwear, taboos about food, rituals around numbers or purity, none of it feels strange when everyone around you treats it as obvious truth. Absurdity becomes invisible once it's embedded in culture. This is why questioning matters. Once someone steps back and asks, "Does this really make sense?" Oui, the absurdity becomes clear. That moment of realization is often the first crack in the wall of belief. It doesn't take a complicated argument. It can be something as simple as wondering why a god would care about which shoe you put on first, or which direction you face when you pray. The smallest question can unravel the biggest structures, and yet, these absurdities continue to shape not just personal lives, but entire societies. Laws, education, healthcare, and human rights are still influenced by beliefs that have no grounding in reason or evidence. Thus, children are raised with fear of imaginary punishments. Adults limit their choices because of ancient taboos. Communities fight over myths as though they were matters of life and death. The cost of absurdity isn't just laughter, it's real human suffering. What makes this even more fascinating is that absurdity doesn't survive in spite of its strangeness. It survives because of it. The more irrational a rule appears, the more it becomes a marker of loyalty. Following it proves you're committed. It separates the devoted from the doubters. Absurdity, in this sense, is a feature, not a flaw. And it's precisely what makes people so reluctant to let go, even when evidence and reason are stacked against it. But there's hope in that too, because once people recognize that absurdity is being used as a test of loyalty, they can see through it. They realize that rules dressed up as sacred commands are just human inventions, arbitrary, inconsistent, and often laughable once exposed. And when that recognition spreads, the power of absurd beliefs begins to fade. So the absurd religious beliefs people follow aren't just curiosities to laugh at. They're reminders of how easily tradition can override reason, how fear can suppress questions, and how power often hides behind the mask of the sacred. But they're also proof of something encouraging, that when people do start asking questions, absurdity unravels quickly, and the very ideas that once felt untouchable are revealed for what they are. And maybe that's the most absurd thing of all, that so much of human history has been shaped by beliefs that collapse the moment you stop taking them seriously. What makes absurd religious beliefs so persistent is the way they intertwine with identity. For many people, questioning the absurd rule isn't just about questioning the rule. It feels like questioning their family, their culture, their community, or even themselves. The absurdity becomes fused with belonging, which is why it can be so difficult to let go, even when the belief makes no sense at all. Take the example of dietary laws. On their own, the rules can seem arbitrary. Don't eat this animal, don't mix this food with that. But when they become part of cultural rhythm, they feel sacred. Breaking them isn't just about what's on your plate. It's about breaking away from everyone you've ever known. The absurdity of the rule itself is invisible once it's tied to memory, ritual, and love for your community. That's why pointing out absurdity isn't always enough, because people aren't just protecting the rule, they're protecting their identity. But history shows us that absurdity has a breaking point. When absurd rules start to cause too much harm, whether through restricting rights, preventing medical care, or forcing unnecessary suffering, people eventually push back. They start to see that sacred doesn't always mean good, and tradition doesn't always mean truth. Some absurd beliefs fade away quietly, others collapse dramatically, but in every case, it begins with someone daring to ask whether the rule actually makes sense. And here's the deeper irony. The very absurdity of these beliefs is what makes them vulnerable. They rely on people not asking questions, not laughing, not noticing the contradictions. The moment someone steps back and says, "Wait a second, this is ridiculous," the spell begins to crack. That's why, throughout history, laughter has been such a powerful force against religious authority. Humor exposes absurdity in a way that logic alone sometimes can't. It breaks the fear and shows people the rules are nothing more than human inventions pretending to be divine. Yet even as old absurdities fade, new ones always arise. Different costumes, different rituals, different sacred rules, but the same pattern. Humans are endlessly inventive in coming up with ways to turn superstition into law, to transform fear into obedience, and to disguise absurdity as holiness. And so the cycle continues. But the good news is this: every absurd belief carries the seed of its own undoing. Because the more absurd it is, the harder it is to defend once people really look at it. The underwear, the food taboos, the purity rituals, the cosmic math equations, the animal worship, all of it begins to unravel under the simple weight of common sense. And once people recognize the absurdity, they can free themselves from the fear and control that came with it. So the most absurd religious beliefs people actually follow aren't just curiosities, they're warnings. They remind us how fragile reason can be in the face of tradition, how powerful authority becomes when it cloaks nonsense in holiness, and how important it is to keep asking questions, because once you start questioning, absurdity can't survive. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson hidden in all of this, that no matter how strange, how controlling, or how entrenched a belief might seem, it can only survive if people stop noticing the absurdity. The moment you notice, the spell is broken, and the chains of absurdity fall away.